Hello. This is a video about supporting the camera when you're doing macro or close-ups out of doors. There are different considerations when you're working indoors, and that's not something I know much about. I can think of 5 cases where you might want to provide support for the camera. Now I say might because some people never use a tripod or any other means of supporting the camera. Some people use a tripod most of the time. Like I imagine most people, I sometimes do and sometimes don't. In my case, it depends upon what I'm doing, and sometimes it depends upon how I feel about it. Do I want to go through the hassle of using a tripod or a monopod or some other means of support? Because I actually prefer working handheld. Although I know that sometimes I could actually get better results if I was working with a tripod. So I can think of these 5 cases where you might want to provide support for the camera. One of them is if you're using very slow shutter speeds in natural light, say half a second, 2 seconds, you need to keep the camera still. The second case is if you're using what I term somewhat slow shutter speeds, and you might be using natural light or flash in these cases. That gets a bit complicated, and we'll talk about that later. But these are shutter speeds where you might get a sharp picture, you might not. The third case is if you're using high magnification, and that would probably be with flash. The fourth is if you're using a technique which means you have to capture several images, for example, for HDR or for focus stacking. And the fifth case is if you need to keep the camera in more or less the same position for a long time, longer than you can actually hold it. And we'll talk again about what sort of circumstance that may be later. So, what means are available for supporting the camera? Let's just think for a moment about what characteristics we'd like to have from whatever it is we're using. Your subjects for close-ups and macros could be anywhere. They could be on the ground, they could be a bit up, but in a position where you can only get at it from underneath. They may be in the middle of some vegetation that you can only get at from a particular angle. They may be high up, you may need to look down on them. So we want to be able to position the camera where we want it in space and also point it in the direction that we want it to be in. And we want it to be, or I want it to be, fairly fast in order to get to that position, because especially with invertebrates, with insects and spiders and so on, if you spend a long time organising your getting the camera in the right place, the subject may have gone by the time you get to take a picture. Also want it to be light enough that I can carry around, and I want to be able to afford it. So I think one of the things to realise is you can't have all this. There are going to be compromises. If you do a lot of work at ground level, then one sort of solution might be appropriate. If you have a certain sort of subject, if you, for example, photograph butterflies at a butterfly farm a lot, then a tripod may be the obvious answer in those circumstances. So it does depend upon what you're doing, but nothing will do everything. So there you may have to do some experimentation. And the other thing is that you can't really tell from a theoretical point of view what's going to work. You may say, well, it's obvious I should use such and such an approach for this sort of subject. It doesn't always work out like that. We've all got very different views and very different things that we're comfortable with. Some people might not like one or two other things I'm going to show you later, because if you carried them around, you might be afraid of people thinking you were a nutcase. And that's something that's never worried me, but it may be a consideration for some people. So next, let's have a look at various bits of equipment, and then we can come back to these 5 cases and talk about how we might use various bits of equipment for those 5 cases. So here's an obvious place to start: a tripod. You can make it taller. You've got a central thing here. Now, one of the things about all these bits of equipment is that they get quite complicated in terms of the various things you can tighten and loosen. And there are 2 things to bear in mind about that. One is it can be quite difficult to work out how to get it to get into certain positions, for example, and you may have to practice a bit in order to be able to do that faster. The other one is that because it's so complicated in terms of all these things, especially with the rig I'm going to show you a bit later, you have to be careful that you don't leave the wrong thing loose so that it can fall over, and you can have it fall over in rather more disastrous ways than that. Now, that's okay, and there are 2 ways, by the way, of using a tripod. One is that you may line the shot up, and you get the camera at the right distance, and you frame it and so on, and then you have a remote release of some sort, either a cable that's plugged into the camera, or a wireless device that you can just press the button, or maybe a smartphone that's connected to the camera wirelessly. In those cases, you can line the shot up, let the camera settle down, and then take the shot remotely, so as to avoid as much as possible the vibrations that you get. Incidentally, if you're using a DSLR, one with a mirror that flaps, there are 2 things that you can do if you're using a tripod in that way. One is the mirror. You get mirror slap, because when you take the picture, the mirror goes up out of the way the picture gets taken, and it comes down again. It doesn't matter about the coming down, but the going up can cause a shock. And you can, in fact, lock the mirror up so that you don't have that. The other thing that you can do with some DSLRs is that instead of, you have these shutters that go across that open and close, and the first shutter is closed to begin with, and it zooms across and opens up so that the picture can be taken, and it whacks something on the other side. Now, obviously they damp it down and so on, but there is a discernible shock there, and that can cause vibration from which you can lose sharpness with the picture. If your camera has it, you can use electronic first curtain shutter, which opens the sensor to the light electronically. It starts being turned off and it just turns it on in one go, so you don't get that shock at the beginning. So you've got a tripod. You might use it in this one way, which is hands off. The other way, and this is the way that I usually use a tripod, is that my hands are actually on here, and that means that I can track things around if they're moving slightly, and I can make adjustments, and I can react when my subject moves and so on. And that's okay. Now, questions, can you reach what you want? Well, okay, I've got a subject that's further down. Well, okay, I can perhaps lower that. But I want to get the camera over here, but I can't move the tripod. Well, you can get in now. I'm not used to using this tripod, and here we get into this business about you need to know your kit in order to be able to do this fast. And I am, with this particular tripod, by no means fast. Now, this is a case, for example, where you want to make sure that's tightly attached there, otherwise it will be swinging around. So you can tighten that and that. And now you've got the situation where you've got this sitting there quite nicely, but the thing can tip over. So you have to get some stability by raising those legs. Then you have to get the camera in the position you want. Now all this takes time, which is why some people don't use tripods. A lot of people don't use tripods for close-ups and macros. And suppose you want to get this camera low down. Well, there's a couple of ways you can try it with this tripod. One is that you can put the camera down like that. Now that's all very well. I'm currently in portrait mode, and I could actually use that, assuming it's not, the legs aren't getting in the way too much. But if I want to get it into landscape mode, I've actually got to have the camera upside down. And personally, I find it very difficult to use a camera upside down. Another thing you may have noticed is that this thing is getting in the way. Now, what's that? It's called a focus rail. And you see, I'm having, of course, I've got to loosen that bit off in order to get that back. And then, there we go, tighten it up again. The focus rail, if I... safe, yes. You can move the camera backwards and forwards. And again, depending on what kit you're using, you may need to do that. And you may need to do it in subtle ways. For example, for focus stacking, you may need to move the camera just a very little bit, a number of times. Take a shot, move it a little bit more, take a shot, and so on. For my purposes, I need a much cruder movement with this. It's got a fast release knob on here. Pull that and I can move it a long way in one go. So again, it depends upon your technique and what you're doing as to exactly how you deploy these bits of kit. This is a configuration, the second configuration you can use to get closer to the ground with this sort of tripod. You can flatten the legs. Now, in this case, suppose I want to get further down like this. And I'm having a bit of trouble loosening and tightening some of these. There, I've got the camera down, but I can't get it level, not with the head that I've got on here. And that's one of the things about these pieces of kit, that exactly what you can do and what you can't do depends upon how the bits of kit work together. And that's sometimes something you can only find out when you try them, unfortunately. Now, what I can do is to flatten these legs completely. And again, I'm not too used to using this, but I do find this one a bit tough to work with. But there we go. Now, I've just managed to imagine it's all wet and dewy here. I've got my camera wet at this point. Now I have to straighten that out. In fact, I haven't got this one now, and then remember to tighten that one up again so it doesn't fall into the wet again. And I want to put this one down some more. There we go. Got it all completely flat. So that's better. That's more nearly level. I can't quite get it level, but it's close. The problem I've got now with this configuration is that imagine I'm working in a flower bed, or I'm on the lawn perhaps, and the flower bed is here, and there's a spider here that I want to take a picture of. The problem is that this leg, and possibly another one depending on the arrangement of the garden, is now crushing a whole line of plants, and there are animals in here I want to photograph. I've frightened them off, and the lady gardener isn't necessarily very happy either about me crushing things. So again, this is one of the things that the sort of things that you may not foresee until you can try these. And it may be a good idea if you're, I don't know, in a camera club perhaps, or perhaps on the forums you can ask about this, that find out what other people's experiences are with these bits of kit. There are people who love tripods of this sort. I actually don't use this one because I find it rather difficult to use, and because of this sort of situation I don't find it entirely suitable for some of what I want, but nothing is completely suitable. Again, you have to find the best compromises, the best trade-offs for the sort of things that you want to use the kit for. So that's a tripod, and here's another one. Now this is the one that I use. I haven't been using a tripod much recently actually, but this is the one that I've been using prior to that. Now what I've got here is the same sort of tripod with a central column, same as the other one. It can go over sideways or downwards, but I've got another arm attached to it, and this one will go out sideways, and it's got a locking mechanism on it so that I can put it into different positions, and it will, now there we go, it's tipping over again now, so you have to be aware of that. And in this case I've got a focus rail, but in this for this focus rail it's got, I don't know if you can see it that way easier perhaps, it's got one bit that goes backwards and forwards and one bit that goes sideways. That can be useful. Now what happens with this if I want to get near the ground? And this is an example of how you have to practice a bit in order to be able to do this. If I loosen this and then take this off, I can turn that around, tighten this one and put this back in here. Fairly straightforward once you've got the hang of it. And you can then make other adjustments, like, did you notice it's tipping over? So I'd have to... And now this is an example of when you're looking for tripods and so on, how easy is it to do various things, and can you do them one-handed? Because I like to keep one hand, when I'm mucking about with the configuration of this, one hand on here to make sure nothing too horrible happens to the camera. Mistakes do happen, especially with me. So now I can, for example, make that go down there, and I can get this really, I can actually get it down onto the ground. I haven't actually done it quite right here, but I can get it on the ground. Except, well, I can't get it on the ground because there's all this stuff on the bottom. Now, I had a case this afternoon where I wanted to photograph a flower with the camera pretty much almost on the ground, but not quite. Now, if it had been on the ground, that's fine because I can use the ground to support the camera, but this needs to be just off the ground, but pointing upwards. And I couldn't do it with all this stuff on here because it got in the way. So you may have to change the configuration while you're using these things. So there we go, there's another tripod. So tripods come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you can also get, there's loads of different ball heads that you can get. Some of them have got triggers on them and so on, very clever bits of kit, which may or may not be good for your purposes. I had one with a trigger that I didn't get on with, for example. you may use smaller tripods. Here we've got 3 tripods. Now this is a solid one. It's pretty good, and that might be useful. Although interestingly enough, in terms of how low you can get it, it doesn't actually get you any lower than that other one does. But it's solid. And here's a smaller one. Now the thing with this is you've got to think, how heavy is my equipment? Because that falls over really easily. I can't do that with this one. It's really pretty solid. Whereas this one is a really sort of weedy thing. And you can get even smaller ones, which, well, I suppose its main merit is that it's small and easy to carry. You know, you can fold it up and it's virtually no size at all. How much use it would be, I don't know. I've got one. I don't know where I got it from or why, but tripods. Then you can use a tripod as what I'd call a dipod. That is, you can, if you put these 2 legs, if you have the camera lined up at right angles to 2 of the legs, so you've got 2 of the legs here and you've got the camera at right angles to it here, you can then rock this backwards and forwards, and that can be quite useful sometimes. I've certainly used a tripod in that way. And then you get monopods where you put the camera on top of an extensible stick like this. And again, now here we're definitely not talking about being able to keep the camera in one exact position for a very slow exposure, but we are providing some stabilization. And again, I can probably do this one-handed. Let me see, I've got one hand here with the camera, and does this drop? No, you see. But again, these it's quite good from that point of view. So a monopod. Now a couple of stranger ones. Off a plunger. Bit of dowel. And I can use that. If I take this camera, I can use that. That fits quite nicely into there, and this works actually with my other cameras as well, and so I can now use this to stabilize the camera. Why is the thing on the bottom? Because if it wasn't, I'm in the wife's flower beds and I'm digging holes in it. This is at least going to help me to be a bit kinder to the surface that I'm working on. And you can have, I've got different lengths of these. I haven't used these much yet. These are a recent invention. But I've got a short one here, and I've got longer ones as well. As to how useful they're going to turn out to be, I don't know. And the strangest one of all, and I've never used this one, it's something I read about or saw on a forum ages ago. It's a piece of string attached to one of the things that you fit to a plate that you fit to a tripod, and you can stabilize it like this. And if you're good at knots and so on, you can you can make this longer and shorter, although I haven't worked out a way to make it shorter one-handed yet. I have to put the camera down and do that. But anyway, it just illustrates that there are lots of ways of skinning this particular cat, and there are bean bags is another thing that people use for low down shots. They'll put the camera on a bean bag, which is quite good in terms of the flexibility it allows you, but it doesn't allow you much flexibility in terms of the positioning of the camera. So there we are. Those are various sorts of bits of equipment that you might use to stabilize your camera, and now we can turn to those 5 cases that I talked about earlier on. So, our 5 cases. The first one was very slow shutter speeds. Now I encounter this when I sometimes go out very early in the morning, around dawn, you can get some lovely photos then of insects which are sitting around waiting to warm up, often covered in dew, and they can look terrific. But the light level is very low at that time of day, and I'll often be using exposures of shutter speeds of a second or more, and in that case I need a tripod, and I take my hands off, and the light can be absolutely lovely at that time of day. Also, if the air is still, and the air does actually tend to be still at that time in the morning, but if at other times of day, if the air is still, you can use these very slow shutter speeds, and again you'd have to use a tripod in order to take those photos. The second case was the somewhat slow ones. Now this gets a bit complicated. First of all, in natural light, it depends upon what magnification you use and how much your hands shake and how awkward the position is, because your hands will shake more if you've got to hold something in a really awkward position than if you can brace yourself in some way and perhaps relax and so on. What we're talking about here is probabilities. How many sharp images are you going to get? What proportion are going to be sharp? How many out of 10 will be sharp? And as I say, it does depend upon the magnification and how much your hands shake and so on. And the idea with any of these stabilization methods, which might be using hands-on with a tripod, using a monopod, a stick, or even a piece of string, the idea is to damp down the vibrations that you're causing to the camera by your hands shaking. And that means, and in those circumstances, by the way, even if I'm using a tripod, I have the image stabilization on the camera. Now the general advice is if you're using a tripod and a hands-off approach, you should turn the image stabilization off, because it can cause problems. I've done some tests and I'm not sure that I found any particular problems, but it can be problematic. You've got to balance that against the fact that if you do a mixture of handheld and tripod work, you may forget to turn the image stabilization back on again. And on balance, for me at least, the risk is probably greater of forgetting to turn the image stabilization back on than it is of getting a bad result from having the image stabilization on when I'm using the tripod. So I do tend to leave the image stabilization on anyway, even though that I know that I may get some poorer results because of it. It's one of those judgments you have to make your own mind up about. And that's with natural light. If you're using flash, let's start out, suppose you're using flash at night. Then all the light that's coming into the camera is coming from the flash. And the flash burst is very fast indeed, perhaps 1/1000th of a second. It varies as to how much power you're using with the flash and the particular flash unit, but let's say 1/1000th of a second, for example. Then that is your effective shutter speed. You can have the camera set to be 1/10th of a second. It doesn't matter, because all the action is taking place in that 1/1000th of a second. So your hands can be shaking as much as you like, but the image won't be blurred because of handshake. It may be out of focus because your handshake has taken the focus away from what you're trying to focus on, but it won't be blurred because of handshake. When you're using flash during the day, you get a combination of light coming into the camera, some of it from the flash and some of it from the ambient light. Now, if the ambient light is providing quite a lot of the overall light that's going into the camera, then the shutter speed does matter. Let's suppose again that you're using 1/10 of a second and you're using flash. Suppose it's quite a bright day. In that case, most of the light, almost all of it might be, coming in from the ambient light over the course of that 1/10 of a second. So if you're working handheld, during that 1/10 of a second, there's plenty of time for handshake to take its effect, even though you're using flash. So you do have to be a bit cautious with flash, not to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I'm using flash, it doesn't matter what shutter speed I use. It does. The third case was high magnification, which again, generally people use flash for. The problem here isn't image blur caused by handshake. The flash is providing most of the light to do with when you're using very high magnification, the effective aperture is very small, and so you have to pump a lot of light at it, and the majority of that is going to come from the flash unit, usually. However, there are a couple of problems. One is actually finding your subject, and if you're using a very high magnification and you're trying to locate something which is 1 millimetre long, whether you're looking through this or looking at the LCD, it doesn't take much handshake to make it very difficult to see what's going on and actually to locate the subject. And then you get the situation of, suppose you've got a scene which is only 3 millimetres across, and you've got a subject which is 1 millimetre across in the middle of that, and what you want to do is to get that subject not in the middle of the scene but just a bit off to the right hand side of the centre. That is really difficult to do handheld, because, or I find it really difficult to do, because my hands shake so much. It's magnified by the magnification of the lens, and I just can't hold the camera steady enough to do that. Now that's a case where some sort of stabilization, whether it's something as simple as this or again hands-on with a tripod, lets you, it calms the whole thing down, it makes it easier to sweep around to find the subject, and it makes it possible to compose a shot rather than having it as rather more guesswork, which is what it is if your hands are shaking a lot and you just try and time it so that it's in the right position at the time you happen to press the shutter button. The fourth example was multiple images. Now, it may or may not matter whether those images are lined up. If you're doing HDR, depending on what software you're using, you can combine images that aren't lined up. In fact, there's another technique where you can take multiple images to and put them together, merge them in order to reduce noise. And in that case, oddly enough, it can be quite important that they're not exactly lined up. On the other hand, if you're doing focus stacking, then you want each of the images to be focused in a precise place, and you'll be wanting to move the camera very slightly. Well, that's another case where some people use a tripod with a rail, where they'll use the rail to move the camera very slightly forwards a bit, take a picture, forwards a bit, take a picture, forwards a bit, or maybe backwards. I don't know which way they do it. And some people do the capture the images for a stack handheld. And this is another example where having something like this will make it easier for you for each of the images that you're capturing, to see where the focus is falling when you want to take for each picture that you take. And for HDR, it may or may not matter whether they're exactly lined up or not. And the last example was when you want to hold the camera in a certain position for a long time. If you try and hold the camera like that for 5 minutes, and I'll bet you your hand will be shaking a lot by the end of that time. In fact, it's just not practical. However, I'll sometimes spend 10 minutes, quarter of an hour photographing the same scene because something's going on, like a spider is wrapping its prey, for example, or other things that are going on. And so I want to keep pointing at this. And so, again, it helps to have at least a bit of stabilization so that you can relax a bit and carry on taking pictures for as long as you want to. And that's about it. So, various reasons for supporting a camera, various ways of doing it, various points of view as to whether it's necessary or not, or it just doesn't work, or you have to do it. Some quite strong views about this. As with everything else, try things, find your own way, experiment and enjoy. That's it for now. Goodbye.